Close your eyes and let yourself drift into a story that began long before the world knew their names. Tonight, we journey back to a time when love wasn't just a feeling, but a revolution waiting to happen. This is the tale of two souls who found each other across an ocean of possibility, in a world that wasn't quite ready for what they would become together. In the autumn of 1966, London pulsed with creativity and change. The air itself seemed to hum with new ideas, new sounds, and new ways of seeing the world. Art galleries buzzed with conversations that lasted until dawn. Musicians wandered the streets with melodies dancing in their heads. And in this swirling symphony of possibility, two very different hearts were about to discover they beat in perfect rhythm. John was restless that November evening, the kind of restlessness that comes from having everything the world thinks you should want, yet feeling like something essential was missing. Fame had wrapped around him like a heavy coat, warm but sometimes suffocating. He'd spent years crafting melodies that made crowds scream and critics nod in approval, but lately, his songs felt like echoes of themselves. He needed something real, something that would shake him awake from the comfortable dream his life had become. Across the city, in a small avant-garde gallery, Yoko was preparing for an exhibition unlike anything London had seen before. Her art wasn't meant to be pretty or easy. It was meant to make people think, to challenge them, to invite them into conversations with their own imaginations. She'd traveled far from her homeland to share these ideas, carrying with her a vision of art that could heal the world, one interaction at a time. The gallery was quiet that evening, filled with the kind of anticipation that comes before something important is about to unfold. Yoko moved through the space, adjusting installations, checking that each piece was positioned exactly where it needed to be. Her work demanded participation, not passive observation. Visitors would need to climb ladders, use magnifying glasses, and engage with the art in ways that traditional galleries rarely asked of their guests. Meanwhile, John found himself walking through the crisp London evening, drawn by curiosity toward the address a friend had mentioned. He'd heard whispers about an artist whose work was so unusual it had to be experienced to be believed. Something in those whispers called to the part of him that had always been attracted to the unexpected, the unconventional, the mysterious. When he pushed open the gallery door, John entered a world that seemed to exist in its own dimension. The space hummed with quiet energy. Objects hung from the ceiling. Pieces sat on the floor, inviting interaction. And in the corner, a simple white ladder stood beneath a canvas, with a magnifying glass hanging from a chain. This was ceiling painting, Yoko's invitation to hope. The viewer was meant to climb the ladder and use the magnifying glass to read what was written on the canvas above. Most people expected something shocking or provocative. After all, this was avant-garde art in the rebellious 60s. But Yoko had something different in mind entirely. So John approached the ladder with the kind of curiosity that had driven him to write his first song, to pick up his first guitar, to dream beyond the boundaries of his Liverpool childhood. He climbed slowly, each step taking him further from the ordinary world below and closer to something he couldn't yet name. At the top of the ladder, he positioned the magnifying glass over the canvas and squinted to read the tiny text printed there. What he saw wasn't shocking or disturbing. It wasn't meant to challenge or provoke. Instead, in small, clear letters, he read a single word that would change everything. Yes, that simple affirmation, that gentle encouragement, that quiet celebration of possibility struck something deep within John's spirit. In a world that seemed to specialize in saying no, in limitation, in cynicism, here was an artist brave enough to whisper yes to hope, yes to connection, yes to the possibility that strangers might find something beautiful together. He climbed down from the ladder, feeling different, as if something inside him had shifted into a new position. The restlessness that had driven him through the London streets was still there, but now it felt less like dissatisfaction and more like anticipation. He looked around the gallery with fresh eyes, seeing not just art objects, but invitations to wonder. That's when he noticed her. Yoko stood near another installation, watching visitors interact with her work. She had the kind of presence that suggested deep waters beneath a calm surface. Her dark hair framed a face that seemed both ancient and timeless, as if she carried wisdom from generations past, while also seeing possibilities that hadn't yet been born. Their eyes met across the gallery space, and in that moment, something clicked into place. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was more like the feeling of finding the missing piece to a puzzle you hadn't realized you were solving. John felt recognized in a way that had nothing to do with his fame or his music. Yoko saw someone whose spirit matched the curiosity and openness her art required. He approached her slowly, the way you might approach a deer in a forest, not wanting to startle or disturb the magic of the moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the same gentleness that had drawn him up the ladder toward that simple word of encouragement. They talked about art, about intention, about the power of small gestures to create large changes. Yoko explained how her pieces were designed to activate the imagination, to invite people into creative collaboration with ideas they might never have encountered otherwise. John found himself sharing thoughts about music he'd never articulated before, about the responsibility that came with the ability to reach people's hearts through sound. The gallery gradually emptied around them, but neither seemed to notice. They were deep in the kind of conversation that feels like coming home after a long journey, not the superficial exchange of information that passes for communication in most social situations, but the real sharing of inner landscapes, of dreams and fears, and hopes for what the world might become. Yoko showed John other pieces in the exhibition. There was painting to hammer a nail, which invited visitors to hammer imaginary nails into a white canvas. The painting would remain unmarked, but the act of participation would complete the artwork in the viewer's mind. John understood immediately that this wasn't about destruction or vandalism. It was about the creative power of intention, about how meaning could exist in the space between action and imagination. As the evening deepened around them, John realized he'd found something he hadn't known he was searching for. Not just an artist whose work moved him, but a mind that operated on frequencies he recognized as his own. Yoko represented possibilities he'd sensed, but never quite been able to name. In her presence, he felt more fully himself than he had in years. They left the gallery together, stepping out into the London night with the comfortable ease of old friends, though they'd known each other for only hours. The city around them seemed different now, charged with new potential. Streetlights looked like stars. The sound of distant traffic became rhythm. Even the cold air felt refreshing rather than harsh. This was how it began, not with fireworks or dramatic declarations, but with recognition. Two artists finding in each other the missing conversation partner they'd been seeking. Two spirits discovering they shared the same frequency, the same desire to use their creativity to make the world more beautiful, more connected, more full of yes than no. As they walked through the quiet streets, neither of them could have predicted what their meeting would mean for the world. They couldn't foresee the music they would create together, the boundaries they would push, or the love that would inspire millions. They were simply two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, ready to begin a journey neither could complete alone. The story of John and Yoko was just beginning, and like all the best love stories, it started with a simple act of faith, the faith to climb a ladder toward a word you couldn't yet see, the faith to share your art with strangers, and the faith to believe that somewhere in the world there might be someone whose heart beats in harmony with your own. With your own. The weeks that followed their meeting moved like a gentle river, each day flowing naturally into the next. John found himself drawn back to the gallery, not just to see Yoko's art, but to continue conversations that seemed to have no end. They would sit on the floor, surrounded by her installations, talking about everything and nothing, the way children do when they discover a new friend who speaks their secret language. Yoko would arrive early each morning, bringing tea in a thermos that they shared from mismatched cups she'd found in charity shops around London. The ritual became sacred to them, this quiet communion before the world woke up and demanded their attention. Steam would rise from their cups like incense, and in that gentle haze, they discovered they saw the world through remarkably similar eyes. John learned that Yoko's childhood had been spent moving between countries, always the outsider looking in, always having to translate not just languages, but entire ways of being. She understood what it felt like to be famous and lonely at the same time, to have your art misunderstood, to carry dreams that felt too big for the spaces you were given to express them. In her presence, John felt permission to be vulnerable in ways his public persona had never allowed. Yoko discovered that beneath John's wit and charm lived a tenderness he rarely showed the world. He spoke about his mother with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. He talked about music as if it were a living thing that needed care and protection. When he played his guitar softly in the gallery after hours, his fingers finding melodies that had never been heard before, she understood that she was witnessing something sacred. Their friendship deepened through small gestures that felt enormous. Yoko would leave tiny notes tucked into John's coat pocket, written in her careful handwriting. Messages like, "The sky is thinking of you today," or "Your laughter sounds like wind chimes." John would respond by bringing her wildflowers he'd picked on his morning walks, or by writing her fragments of songs on napkins during lunch breaks. They began creating together without planning it, the way streams merge to form a river. John would hum a melody while Yoko worked on an installation, and she would adjust her movements to match his rhythm. She would describe a color that existed only in her imagination, and he would find chords that painted that exact shade in sound. Neither of them called it collaboration yet. They simply called it breathing. The art world began to notice their connection before they did. Gallery visitors would comment on the energy between them, the way they seemed to communicate in glances and half-finished sentences. Critics wrote about the influence each was having on the other's work, though John and Yoko were too absorbed in their discoveries to read the reviews. Winter settled over London like a soft blanket, and their conversations moved from the gallery to long walks through Hyde Park. They would bundle up in scarves and coats, their breath visible in the cold air, as they shared stories and dreams. John showed Yoko places from his childhood when the Beatles visited London, corners where he'd written his first songs, benches where he'd sat wondering if anyone would ever understand his music. Yoko took John to museums and exhibitions that existed off the beaten path, places where experimental artists gathered to share ideas that mainstream galleries weren't ready to embrace. She introduced him to concepts that stretched his understanding of what art could be, what music could become, what love might look like if it wasn't confined by traditional expectations. Their relationship existed in a space between friendship and something deeper, something that didn't have a name yet. They were content to let it unfold naturally, the way flowers open in their own time. There was no rush, no pressure to define what they meant to each other. They were simply two people who had found a perfect companion for exploring the mysteries of creativity and connection. Christmas approached, and London transformed into something magical. Lights twinkled in shop windows, carols drifted from street corners, and everywhere there was a sense of anticipation, of gifts waiting to be discovered. John and Yoko spent hours walking through the decorated streets, marveling at how the familiar city had become something entirely new. On Christmas Eve, they found themselves at the gallery alone, surrounded by Yoko's installations that had become like old friends. The space felt different in the winter darkness, more intimate somehow, as if it were holding them gently while the world celebrated outside. John had brought his guitar, and Yoko had made tea, and they settled onto cushions on the floor like children at a sleepover. John played softly, melodies that seemed to emerge from the silence itself. Yoko listened with her eyes closed, occasionally humming along when she felt the music calling to her voice. They weren't performing for anyone but each other, and in that freedom, something new began to emerge. A sound that belonged entirely to them, a musical conversation that no one else could have created. "I keep having this dream," Yoko said during a pause between songs. "There's a garden where all the plants sing different notes, and when the wind blows through them, they create the most beautiful symphony. But the gardener has to tend each plant with such care, listening to its unique voice, making sure it has everything it needs to contribute its part to the whole." John set down his guitar and looked at her with the kind of attention that makes a person feel truly teen. "What do you think the dream means?" "I think it means that love is like being a gardener," she said softly. "You have to listen to each person's unique song and help them sing it as beautifully as possible. And when you do that, when you really hear someone and help them be themselves, the whole world becomes more musical." The truth of her words settled into the space between them, like snow falling on quiet ground. John felt something shift in his chest, a recognition so deep it seemed to come from his bones. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just someone to love, but someone who understood that love itself was an art form, requiring the same attention and care he brought to his music. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the shadows dance on the gallery walls. Outside, London celebrated with fireworks and laughter, but inside their small sanctuary, John and Yoko discovered that the most profound celebrations happen in whispers, in the space between heartbeats, in the moment when two people realize they found their way home. When John finally spoke, his voice carried the gentleness of someone handling something precious. "Would you like to collaborate on a song together? Not for anyone else, just for us, just to see what happens when we stop being careful and let our voices find each other." Yoko's smile was like sunrise breaking over water. "Yes," she said, and the word carried all the same hope and possibility as the message John had read on her ceiling painting that first night. "Let's see what kind of music we can make when we're not afraid." And so, as Christmas gave way to a new year full of unknown possibilities, John Lennon and Yoko Ono began creating something that had never existed before. Not just songs, but a new way of being together in the world. A partnership that would challenge everything people thought they knew about love, about art, about the courage required to live authentically in a world that preferred its heroes to be simple and its love stories to follow predictable patterns. Their first collaborative song emerged like morning mist, slowly and naturally, without force or expectation. They called it simply Music Box because it felt delicate and precious, like something that might break if handled too roughly. John would play a simple melody on his guitar, while Yoko would add sounds that weren't quite singing and weren't quite speaking, but something entirely new that lived in the space between. The recording sessions, if they could be called that, took place in John's small home studio. It was nothing fancy, just a room with decent acoustics and equipment that worked reliably. But when they sat together on the worn carpet, guitars and notebooks scattered around them like fallen leaves, the space transformed into something sacred. They would light candles, not for atmosphere, but because the soft light helped them listen more carefully to each other. Yoko brought instruments John had never seen before, small bells from Tibet that sang when the wind touched them, a wooden flute carved by an artist in Japan whose grandfather had made instruments for temple ceremonies, stones from beaches around the world that made different sounds when tapped together in various combinations. She showed John how music could come from anywhere, how the entire world was an orchestra waiting to be discovered. John, in turn, introduced Yoko to the magic of harmony, the way voices could dance together to create something larger than either could achieve alone. He taught her about the spaces between notes, how silence was as important as sound, how a song could breathe in pause and gather strength before continuing its journey. They learned each other's musical languages, the way travelers learn to navigate foreign cities, with patience and wonder and occasional delightful confusion. As winter melted into spring, their creative partnership began attracting attention from John's bandmates and the music industry that surrounded them. Some people were curious, others concerned, many simply confused by the unusual sounds emerging from their collaborations. But John and Yoko had learned to create a protective bubble around their work, a space where external opinions couldn't penetrate their creative process. They would spend entire afternoons in record shops, not buying anything, but listening to music from every corner of the world. Yoko would close her eyes and sway to rhythms from countries she'd never visited, while John discovered that his understanding of melody expanded when he heard it through her ears. They found a small shop run by an elderly man who collected rare recordings, and he began setting aside albums he thought would interest them, creating a musical education that no school could have provided. Their walks through London became longer and more exploratory. They would start in one neighborhood and let their conversation guide their footsteps, often ending up in parts of the city neither had seen before. Yoko showed John how to notice things he'd been walking past his entire life, the way shadows fell across brick walls, the patterns pigeons made when they gathered in squares, the music that lived in the sound of buses and bicycle bells, and children playing in distant playgrounds. John taught Yoko about the poetry hidden in everyday conversation, how people revealed their deepest truths in casual remarks, how love could be expressed in the way someone made tea or remembered your favorite biscuit. They became collectors of small moments, gathering them like pressed flowers in the pages of their shared memory. One afternoon in May, they were sitting by the Thames, watching boats drift past, when Yoko said something that would stay with John forever. "I think love is like water," she mused, trailing her fingers in the river. "It takes the shape of whatever container holds it, but it never loses its essential nature. It can be a gentle rain or a powerful ocean, but it's always itself." John watched her face as she spoke, noticing the way the light caught in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words, as if each one mattered. "What do you think our container looks like?" he asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that starts small and grows until it illuminates everything around it. "I think we're still building it," she said. "Every song we create together, every conversation, every moment like this one. We're making something that didn't exist before, something that can hold all the different kinds of love we're discovering." That evening, they wrote their most beautiful song yet. They called it Two Rivers, and it was about the way separate streams could flow together without losing their individual characters. John played a melody that reminded listeners of water over stones, while Yoko added vocals that sounded like wind through tall grass. When they finished recording it, they sat in silence for a long time, both aware that they'd created something that perfectly captured the mystery of their connection. Summer brought new adventures. They would pack simple picnics and take trains to small towns outside London, places where they could walk anonymously through farmers' markets and village greens. John loved seeing the world through Yoko's eyes, the way she found wonder in everything, from the pattern of leaves on ancient oak trees to the way local accents changed from town to town. She helped him remember that fame was just one small part of who he was, that underneath all the recognition and expectation lived the same curious boy who'd once written songs in his bedroom. Yoko, meanwhile, discovered that love didn't require her to become smaller or less herself. With John, she felt free to be exactly as creative, as unusual, as visionary as her art demanded. He celebrated the parts of her personality that others had found difficult to understand, and in his acceptance, she found permission to shine even brighter. Their creative collaborations grew more ambitious. They began working on what they called invisible sculptures, artworks that existed only in the instructions they wrote for others to perform. "Imagine a bird that sings only songs of forgiveness," read one. "Listen for it at dawn and dusk when the world is practicing mercy." These pieces required participants to use their imagination as the primary medium, turning art into a form of meditation and play combined. John started incorporating similar concepts into his music, writing songs that asked listeners to imagine different worlds, better possibilities, futures where love was the common language everyone spoke fluently. Yoko's influence was making his lyrics more hopeful, more focused on what could be, rather than what was wrong with what already existed. They created a series of postcards featuring photographs they'd taken during their walks, paired with short poems or instructions for small acts of kindness. "Send this to someone you've never thanked," read one. "Plant a seed and dedicate its growth to peace," suggested another. They distributed these freely, leaving them in cafes and bookshops, tucking them into library books, giving them to strangers who seemed like they might need a gentle reminder that the world contained more beauty than sorrow. As autumn returned to London, John and Yoko realized their friendship had grown into something deeper without either of them noticing the exact moment of transformation. Like a song that modulates from one key to another so smoothly, the listener doesn't notice until they're already in new harmonic territory. Their love had evolved naturally, from companionship to something richer and more complex. They didn't need to discuss it or define it. They simply began spending more time together, sharing meals and dreams and quiet evenings, reading by the fireplace in John's living room. Yoko would work on her art while John composed, the scratch of her pencil and the soft strumming of his guitar, creating a domestic symphony that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Their friends and colleagues began to understand that something significant was happening, though neither John nor Yoko felt the need to make formal announcements. Love, they discovered, was not a public performance, but a private miracle that revealed itself through countless small choices to care for each other's happiness and growth. The music they created together grew more sophisticated as they learned to anticipate each other's creative instincts. They developed a wordless communication system during recording sessions, a language of glances and gestures that allowed them to experiment fearlessly, knowing their partner would catch them if they fell and celebrate them when they soared. As winter approached again, exactly 1 year after their first meeting, John and Yoko found themselves back in the gallery where it all began. The space looked different now, filled with new installations and different lighting, but the magic that had brought them together still hummed in the walls and floor and ceiling. They climbed the white ladder together this time, taking turns looking through the magnifying glass at the word that had started everything. Yes, looked exactly the same, but they understood it differently now. It wasn't just an affirmation or an encouragement. It was a promise, a commitment to keep saying yes to love, to creativity, to the possibility that two people could create something together that neither could imagine alone. Standing at the top of that ladder, their hands touching on the magnifying glass, John and Yoko felt the profound gratitude that comes from recognizing a perfect gift when it arrives in your life. They had found not just love, but the right kind of love for who they were as artists and dreamers and believers in the power of imagination to transform the world. The gallery was quiet around them, holding space for this moment of recognition and celebration. Outside, London continued its eternal dance of movement and noise and possibility. But inside, in the gentle circle of their shared attention, John Lennon and Yoko Ono stood together at the place where their story began, ready to climb down and continue building the beautiful, unusual, creative life they were learning to live as one. Their love story became a quiet revolution, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that changes how people understand what it means to care for another person completely. As 1967 unfolded around them, like a flower opening to sunlight, John and Yoko discovered that their partnership was teaching them things about themselves they'd never known existed. The morning ritual of sharing tea had expanded into something more elaborate and wonderful. Yoko would arrive at John's flat carrying a small basket filled with treasures she'd discovered during her early morning walks. A feather from a bird she'd never seen before, a smooth stone worn perfect by decades of rain, a pressed flower from someone's garden that had called to her as she passed. John would have breakfast waiting, simple food prepared with the kind of attention usually reserved for important ceremonies. They would sit cross-legged on cushions in his living room, the morning light streaming through windows that looked out over the awakening city. Between sips of tea, they would examine Yoko's daily treasures, creating stories about where each item had come from and what adventures it might have experienced before finding its way to them. These moments felt sacred, not because they were trying to be spiritual, but because they were paying such careful attention to the small miracles that surrounded them every day. John began keeping a notebook specifically for recording the things Yoko said that made him see the world differently. "Music is just organized feelings," she told him one morning while watching pigeons gather breadcrumbs outside the window. "The feelings were always there, but music gives them a shape people can recognize." He wrote that down, word for word, understanding that she'd just explained something about his own work that he'd never been able to articulate. Yoko started a similar notebook for John's observations, which often arrived disguised as casual comments that revealed profound truths. "I think kindness is the most sophisticated emotion," he said one afternoon, while they watched a woman help an elderly man cross a busy street. "It requires you to pay attention to what someone else needs and then act on that awareness without expecting anything in return." She captured his words carefully, recognizing the philosophy that would later influence their most important work together. Their creative collaborations evolved into something that challenged every assumption people had about what music could be. They began incorporating silence as an instrument, using pauses and spaces between sounds to create emotional landscapes that traditional songs couldn't explore. Their recording sessions became meditative experiences where they would sit quietly for long periods, listening to the ambient sounds of the studio, the hum of equipment, the distant traffic, the rhythm of their own breathing. From these listening sessions emerged compositions that barely resembled conventional songs, yet somehow felt more musical than anything either had created before. They recorded the sound of rain on different surfaces, discovering that water falling on leaves created entirely different rhythms than water falling on stone or metal or fabric. They captured the acoustic properties of various rooms in John's house, learning that the bathroom had a natural reverb that made whispers sound like prayers, while the kitchen absorbed sound in ways that made even loud noises feel intimate. Spring brought an invitation that would change everything. A gallery in New York wanted to exhibit Yoko's work, and she was torn between the opportunity and her reluctance to leave London, to leave the daily rhythms she and John had established. They spent hours walking along the Thames, discussing what it would mean for her to travel across an ocean, how they could maintain their creative partnership across such distance. John surprised himself by suggesting he come with her, not as a famous musician seeking new audiences, but simply as someone who couldn't imagine being separated from his creative partner and dearest friend. The idea felt both completely natural and slightly terrifying, like all the best decisions in life. They would be stepping into unknown territory together, trusting that their connection was strong enough to survive transplantation to new soil. The weeks before departure were filled with preparation that felt like gathering supplies for an expedition to unexplored lands. They packed carefully, bringing not just clothes and necessities, but objects that had become important to their shared life. The mismatched teacups, the notebooks filled with song fragments and art ideas, the small collection of stones and feathers and pressed flowers that had accumulated during their morning rituals. Yoko introduced John to the Japanese concept of mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things. As they packed their London life into suitcases, they practiced appreciating their flat, their neighborhood, their daily routines, knowing that when they returned, they would be different people who would experience these familiar places in new ways. John found himself thinking about how travel changes, not just your location, but your identity. In New York, he wouldn't be surrounded by the history and expectations that had shaped his sense of himself in Liverpool and London. He would have the freedom to discover who he was when removed from everything familiar, with only Yoko as his anchor in the unknown. Their last evening in London was spent at the gallery where they'd first met, now empty between exhibitions. They sat on the floor where John's ladder still stood, though Yoko's installations had been carefully packed and shipped ahead to New York. The space echoed differently without her artwork, but it still held the memory of that first conversation, that first recognition of kindred spirits finding each other. They took turns climbing the ladder one final time, reading the word that had started everything. Yes seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of possibility that had guided them through their first year of friendship and love and creative partnership. They understood now that saying yes to each other had meant saying yes to a way of life that prioritized curiosity over comfort, growth over security, love over fear. The flight across the Atlantic was John's first time traveling with someone who made the journey itself feel like an adventure rather than simply transportation between destinations. Yoko had brought small art supplies in her carry-on bag, and during the long flight, they created tiny collaborative pieces on napkins and the backs of boarding passes, miniature sculptures made from sugar packets and stirring sticks, poems written in the margins of airline magazines, messages to their future selves, written on scraps of paper they tucked into the seat pockets for other travelers to discover. When the plane descended toward New York, they pressed their faces to the window like children, marveling at the grid of lights stretching to the horizon. The city looked like a circuit board, designed by someone with an enormous imagination. Patterns of illumination that suggested millions of individual stories, all unfolding simultaneously in the darkness below. John felt a familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement, the same feeling he'd experienced before stepping onto stages in front of thousands of people. But this was different because he wasn't performing a role he'd rehearsed. He was simply being himself, traveling with the person who had helped him discover that his authentic self was more interesting and capable of love than any persona he could construct. The taxi ride from the airport took them through neighborhoods that seemed to exist in different decades simultaneously. Ancient brownstones stood next to gleaming office buildings. Street vendors sold food that smelled like recipes passed down through generations, while neon signs advertised the newest trends and technologies. New York felt like a city where past and future coexisted in a constant creative tension, the perfect environment for artists who specialized in making new things from unexpected combinations. Their hotel room was small, but positioned high enough to offer a view of the city that took their breath away. They stood at the window for a long time, holding hands and watching the patterns of traffic and pedestrians far below. John realized he was seeing not just a new city, but a new version of himself reflected in Yoko's eyes. Someone brave enough to follow love and curiosity wherever they might lead. That first night in New York, they lay in the unfamiliar darkness, listening to sounds they'd never heard before. Sirens with different pitches than London's, car horns that seemed to speak in American accents, the distant rumble of subway trains traveling through tunnels beneath the city, like a mechanical heartbeat. They fell asleep holding hands, two travelers who had discovered that home wasn't a place, but a feeling of being completely understood and accepted by another person. When morning light filtered through the hotel curtains, John and Yoko woke to find themselves in a new country, a new chapter of their story, ready to begin. They made tea using the small electric kettle they'd brought from London, recreating their morning ritual in this strange new setting. But even familiar gestures felt different here, charged with the electricity of possibility that seemed to pulse through New York's very air. The gallery opening was still 3 days away, giving them time to explore the city and acclimate to its rhythms. They walked through neighborhoods that felt like entire worlds contained within a few city blocks. In Greenwich Village, they discovered coffee shops where poets read their work to audiences of artists and dreamers who looked like they'd stepped out of the future. In Central Park, they found quiet spaces that felt almost like countryside, complete with trees and grass, and birds who seemed unaware they lived in one of the world's largest cities. Yoko showed John how to navigate the subway system, which felt like traveling through the city's circulatory system. The underground platforms were filled with music from buskers who had turned the tunnels into concert halls, each station offering a different soundtrack for the journey. John found himself listening with new ears, hearing how the acoustics of enclosed spaces transformed familiar instruments into something entirely fresh and unexpected. They visited museums and galleries, seeing art that challenged every assumption John had about what creativity could accomplish. Yoko moved through these spaces like someone coming home after a long journey, pointing out techniques and concepts that would influence her own work. John began to understand that art wasn't just decoration or entertainment, but a form of communication that could reach places in people's hearts and minds that ordinary conversation couldn't access. In the evenings, they would return to their hotel room and sit by the window, watching the city transform itself from day to night. John would play his guitar softly while Yoko sketched in her notebook, both of them processing the overwhelming stimulation of new sights and sounds and ideas. These quiet moments felt like islands of peace in the ocean of sensation that surrounded them. The night before the gallery opening, they walked through Times Square, overwhelmed by the brightness and noise and energy of the city's most famous intersection. Yoko explained that her exhibition would be quite different from this celebration of commerce and entertainment. Her art asked people to slow down, to pay attention, to engage with their own imagination, rather than simply consume what others had created for them. John understood that bringing Yoko's quiet, contemplative art to this loud, fast-moving city was an act of courage. She was offering something precious and fragile to a world that often seemed to value only what was big and loud and immediately impressive. But he also knew that cities like New York needed exactly what she was offering: spaces for reflection and wonder, and the kind of deep thinking that could only happen when people were invited to participate in creating meaning, rather than simply receiving it. As they prepared for sleep that final night before the opening, John felt the same mixture of anticipation and calm he'd experienced before their most successful recording sessions. Something important was about to happen, something that would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't yet predict. But they were facing it together, two artists who had learned to trust each other's vision and support each other's dreams. The story of John and Yoko was about to enter a new phase, one that would challenge them in unexpected ways and teach them that love could be not just a private miracle between two people, but a force for creating positive change in the wider world. Tomorrow would bring the opening of Yoko's exhibition, and with it, the beginning of their public life as creative partners committed to using their art to plant seeds of peace and understanding wherever they traveled. The morning of the gallery opening arrived with the kind of gentle light that makes everything look like it's been painted with watercolors. John woke first, watching Yoko sleep peacefully beside him. Her face relaxed in the soft dawn glow filtering through their hotel window. The city was already humming with life 20 stories below. But up here, in their quiet sanctuary, time moved differently. Like honey dripping from a spoon. He slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to disturb her rest, and made tea using their small electric kettle. The familiar ritual grounded him, connecting this momentous day to all the ordinary mornings they'd shared in London. As steam rose from their mismatched cups, John felt a deep contentment settle over him like a favorite blanket. Today would bring new experiences, new people, new possibilities, but the foundation of their partnership remained steady and strong. Yoko stirred as the aroma of tea reached her, opening her eyes with the slow grace of someone emerging from beautiful dreams. "Good morning, my love," she whispered, her voice still soft with sleep. John brought her tea to the bed, and they sat together, watching the city wake up, pointing out details they'd missed in yesterday's explorations. A rooftop garden where someone had created a small oasis of green in the concrete landscape. Windows where people were beginning their own morning rituals. Tiny glimpses into thousands of other lives unfolding simultaneously. They dressed carefully for the opening, choosing clothes that felt both special and authentically themselves. Yoko wore a simple white dress that seemed to glow against her dark hair, while John selected a jacket he'd bought in London specifically for important occasions. As they prepared, they moved around each other with the easy choreography of people who had learned to share space gracefully. Each small gesture an expression of consideration and care. The gallery was located in a neighborhood that felt like it existed in its own time zone, where old brick buildings housed spaces dedicated to pushing the boundaries of what art could be and do. As their taxi pulled up to the address, John felt his heart quicken with anticipation. Through the large windows, he could see people already gathering, their silhouettes moving among Yoko's installations, like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance. And so their love story continues to whisper through the decades. A gentle reminder that the most profound connections begin with simple recognition. Two hearts that found their perfect rhythm in a London gallery, teaching us that love grows strongest when nurtured with curiosity, creativity, and the courage to say yes to possibility. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the world, love stories like theirs are still beginning, still blooming, still lighting the way forward with hope